What is a human? A miserable little pile of silicon. But enough talk. Have NES Works episode 125.
Did you ever know that you're my hero?
After several consecutive episodes of some tough-to-stomach games, it's nice to finally have a reprieve. I wouldn't call Monster Party an all-time classic, but at least it's interesting, well-made, and even seems to have a creative point of view behind it. Monster Party, one of those games that really embodies the weird side of the NES. I mean, Jekyll and Hyde did too, but Monster Party manages to be far more playable and, well, I don't know if polished is the word exactly, but certainly it holds together more convincingly. And why wouldn't it? Developer Human Entertainment had been plugging away at the NES since before Human Entertainment actually existed. Under the name Try, they had produced the iconic Pro Wrestling for Nintendo. They followed that up by churning out Power Pad-related games for Bandai, which honestly had far more charm to them than was actually necessary. I mean, geez, dance aerobics wasn't just entertaining in an unconventionally mass-market sense, it was pretty innovative too. I don't know if I'd call Monster Party innovative, necessarily, but as Bandai action games go, it's way better than it has any right to be. And it doesn't sacrifice its personality in the process. Which is to say that this is one bizarre video game. Monster Party shipped in a box laden with classic Western movie monsters like Fishmen, Dracula, and Medusa. And these do appear in the game. But anyone who saw this box and expected something along the lines of Castlevania, which also featured those monsters, surely received a massive, unexpected shock. Despite the cover art and the presence of in-game creatures that riff heavily on Hollywood themes, Monster Party ultimately had a decidedly Japanese point of view. Not in the cringy, Japan is so weird sense of 2003 comedy bloggers trying to convince you that the vending machines you find every block or so in Tokyo all dispense used schoolgirl panties, but rather in the sense that the game's nightmarish visuals draw heavily upon Japanese horror themes. The backgrounds often have an eerie, organic quality, almost like melting flesh. But not in the, yes, we also saw aliens way of 80s games trying to convert H.R. Giger phallus-scapes into pixel form. At times, Monster Party does appear to take place inside of a living body, but one that feels incredibly distinct from Contra's rapid-fire run through an oversized xenomorph. Most of the common monsters you face here have the gangly, freakish appearance of yokai. You fight bizarre samurai, tempura shrimp, a skewer of kushiage, and a golem that appears to be a Gundam carved from wood with its face replaced by a Hanewa. The first guys you battle in-game appear to be Japanese teen delinquents. All of this is to say, Monster Party gives us one of those rare instances in the 80s in which American kids were handed pure, freebase quality Japanese culture without having it all sanded down to resemble the things we saw on our television shows at the time. On the contrary, Bandai removed or softened quite a few overt references to American media from the cancelled Japanese version, which appeared in a few magazine previews back in the day and was unearthed and dumped for the internet a decade ago. A few of those references remain. For example, the hooded guys in the final tower turn out to have elephant heads once you unmask them, an amusingly literal reference to the film The Elephant Man, a cinematic dramatization of the life of Joseph Merrick by a young fellow named David Lynch. Likewise, you face off against a talking potted plant at one point, a riff on the 1960 movie Little Shop of Horrors, which had been memorably remade a couple of years before Monster Party's debut by director Frank Oz of The Muppets. Oh, and at one point, you fight a boss who summons a pair of zombies at you. But you don't fight the zombies. You win the battle by simply watching their dance routine. A nod to Michael Jackson's Thriller video, if ever there was one. But lots changed in translation. The fight against the ape man riding a horse in front of a ruined Statue of Liberty is now more of an Ichabod Crane creature. The Mogwai that becomes a gremlin is now just a cat that turns feral. The alien xenomorph is now the Grim Reaper, and its eggs now shoot bubbles instead of facehuggers. A perambulatory head referencing John Carpenter's The Thing now takes the form of a giant spider. And the nod to Audrey 2 transforms her from a Venus flytrap with a microphone into a pitcher plant. Even the little Jason Voorhees monsters have undergone a transformation, their hockey masks replaced with catcher's masks. And those last two changes kind of work, since the main character wields a baseball bat. I don't know if the pitcher-catcher puns were deliberate, probably not, but even accidental genius still counts as genius. In any case, I don't think the changes hurt the game. If anything, they make its bestiary even more bizarre and inconsistent, which fits the chaotic theme of the game's nightmare world. I mean, one of the first bosses you meet is a dead lizard. And not just dead, but sprawled out and stiffened with rigor mortis, its body bloated and tongue lolling to the ground as a fly hovers over it. This is clearly not a game whose creators concerned themselves with bringing comfort and peace to children. The surreal atmosphere makes Monster Party feel like the kind of game you see a lot of in import software from the era, except that this one wasn't an import, it only shipped in the US. That said, its fundamentally goofy premise feels right at home with the likes of Blaster Master, in which a child became a galactic hero after saving the solar system from alien marauders whom he discovered when his pet frog got into the stash of nuclear waste in his backyard. This time around, you play as an elementary-age kid named Mark, who is confronted by a demon named, improbably, Bert, while walking home from school. Bert turns out to be a friendly demon, but not a demon who really understands consent, as he promptly abducts Mark to his own world. Bert assumes Mark to be some manner of warrior thanks to his baseball bat, and recruits Mark, quite without acquiescence, to liberate his world from other, less friendly monsters. Somewhere along the way, Mark and Bert's bodies become fused together by the powers of the demon world. That's a pretty rough school night for poor Mark. But it turns out that Bert wasn't really wrong about Mark. The kid is a damn good demon destroyer with that baseball bat, and this introduces us to yet another little guy freaky guy transformation in the tradition of Amagon and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There must have been something in the water in 1988. Although Monster Party sends you into the fray as Mark, you have the ability to take on Bert's form as well. This transformation, which requires you to collect a power-up, allows you to choose between two different sets of combat abilities. Mark plays like your typical little platform guy, running and jumping and using his bat as a short-range melee attack. The bat gives him less range than Simon Belmont's whip, but better range than Link's pitiful sword in Zelda 2. And his athleticism falls somewhere between the two, making for a perfectly functional 8-bit character with no real surprises. Bert, on the other hand, moves around more freely. Being a winged demon, he can fly when you pump the jump button, in the tradition of earlier Bandai protagonist Chubby Cherub. Unlike Mark, Bert fires a laser beam that travels in a straight line across the screen. Toward the end of the game, his laser receives an upgrade that doubles its power and gives it a sort of dual wave effect, greatly increasing his combat prowess over Mark's. Up until that point, though, there's no particular best protagonist to play as. Mark may have a shorter attack range and more wind-up time, but his bat gives him the ability to deflect projectiles. Pretty much anything an enemy chucks at you, you can hit right back at them with a well-timed swing. When a common enemy fires something, a single reflected shot will almost always take them out in a single hit, even if they would normally soak up a half-dozen bat strikes or laser zaps. And most of the bosses love to shoot things at you, so smacking their attacks back toward them allows you to whittle down their health while maintaining a safe distance. And that's good, because you don't really have a lot of control over when you swap forms between Mark and Bert. Rather than regulating the change yourself, Bert emerges only when Mark collects what appears to be a Dr. Mario pill. Not that anyone knew what Dr. Mario was at this point, of course. Picking up one of these capsules causes Mark to transform temporarily into Bert, who takes charge of their shared body for as long as an invisible timer ticks down. After that, you shift back to Mark, though you can delay the reverse change by collecting certain consumables that extend Bert's active duration. But ultimately, the only real control you have over their morph power really boils down to whether or not you pick up a capsule. These aren't even a random element. Specific enemies drop the same power-ups, whether health refills or transformation drugs, every time you kill them. In my opinion, this is probably the one place where Monster Party truly stumbles. The game largely removes the tactical factor of transformation from the player's hands, forcing you to adhere to the rhythms established by the level designers. Unlike in Jekyll and Hyde, where you generally want to delay transformation as long as possible, or in Amagon, where you need to take the pros and cons of each form into consideration at all times, Monster Party pretty much gives you the ability to turn into Bert when you need it. As long as you don't dawdle or skip a pill drop, you don't need to worry about being stuck in Mark form in a situation that Mark can't handle. And the battles you do fight as Mark tend to be tailored to his abilities. Oh, and Monster Party does stumble in one other respect. The final tower stage contains 3 bosses, but defeating all 3 of them effectively soft locks the game until you continue. The bosses in Monster Party hold the keys that allow you to advance to the next stage, and you need to defeat a certain number of bosses per stage in order to open the door at the end. This is fairly simple in the early stages, just duck into every door you encounter and fight any bosses you may happen to meet within, but toward the end, such as in the confusing labyrinth level before the tower, it's not too difficult to accidentally reach the final door without a key. In the tower, however, you acquire the key by beating 2 bosses. If you fight the third, the key disappears. You may not even notice this because the game doesn't present you with a collectible token or even a fanfare when you acquire a key. An icon just shows up in your status bar. Likewise, when you lose the tower key, the only indication is that the status bar icon quietly vanishes. As it turns out, this appears to be a coding error, since the third boss was added to the US version of the game in localization. But according to the cutting room floor, the programmers forgot to account for it. So the game looks to see if you've defeated exactly 2 bosses, not 2 or more bosses, when it does a check for key status. Whoops. Still, there are worse and more horrendous failings to be found in NES games. This one seems pretty innocuous, especially given that Monster Party is pretty easy. And it's charming and fun, too. Even beyond the somewhat recognizable Hollywood references, Monster Party has a whimsical sense of humor that comes through in details like, for example, the gigantic shark fins that turn out to be attached to tiny little fish masquerading as far more dangerous predators. The dad humor of the common foes and weirdo boss encounters help leaven the frequently gruesome vibe that permeates the game. The oozing blood-drenched horror and rotting lizards and freaky eyeball monsters. Monster Party has a ton of personality, and it's especially unusual for a Bandai release in that it doesn't obviously tie into an existing media property or require the power pad. It's just a goofy, weird NES release that exists on its own oddball merits, and that makes it notable in its own right. I suppose you could say the same thing for the other human Bandai project this episode. Although, unlike Monster Party, Street Cop does require the use of the power pad. Still, this is as different a power pad creation as dance aerobics, maybe even more so. Rather than dwelling on fitness and exercise themes, Street Cop instead places you in the shoes of a flatfoot, walking the beat and keeping the mean streets clean. It's kind of a mess of a game, with the most imbecilic power pad control setup that the NES ever had the misfortune to experience. But at the same time, it's not another running-in-place exercise game, and that counts for something. You play the role of Ben, a smiling copper whose gormless expression disguises a thirst for justice, or at least an enthusiasm for battering minor offenders with a blunt weapon. Ben has to oppress crime and criminals through 6 stages of New York City, using the power pad to navigate the streets while making use of a variety of crime-stopping and cop-improving items. This would make for a perfectly tolerable standard NES game, but alas, Street Cop is not a standard NES game. Functions that would come perfectly naturally to you on the basic D-pad controller become exercises in frustration and physical contortion when mapped to the power pad. You need to navigate left and right, moving into and out of the screen by way of lanes, a setup similar to, say, Double Dragon or Mag Max, far more rigid and tortuous. You also need to use items that you collect in each stage, some of which function as buffs for Ben, and some of which cause damage or debilitation to criminals. The final stage becomes a platformer of sorts involving a shootout with enemies. On a power pad! God bless human entertainment for attempting to mix things up with this exercise controller, but the end result does not fare well. Street Cop reminds me of Gumshoe, and not in a good way. Gumshoe attempted to reinvent the light gun shooter by casting you as a sort of pistol-wielding guardian angel for a detective, but it all felt a little too touchy and imprecise to work as promised. Likewise, Street Cop attempts to do way too much with way too indirect a control system. The simple act of moving around New York takes a lot of getting used to, and trying to hunt down and stop criminals with this setup feels wildly unbalanced. I know the Power Pad is all about exercise, but Street Cop is an exercise in futility. Boom. Seriously though, I want to like this game, just for its sheer chutzpah. Who on earth would have thought you could turn the Power Pad into a controller for a beat cop? Well, it turns out you can't, at least not easily. The manual writers seem to realize it too. They break down each stage in exhaustive detail, up to and including information on the items available in each stage, which ones you need to defeat the bosses, and how exactly they work. The manual for a well-designed game can afford to leave a lot of discovery up to the player. The fact that Street Cop goes into such tremendous, granular depth all the way up to the final boss shows exactly how much confidence the designers had in the accessibility of their work. Overall, the game is a brave effort, but like Jekyll and Hyde, whatever mad ambitions drove the creation of the game didn't quite pan out. Nintendo Power didn't have too much to say about either of these games. Mainly pack-watch previews, as usual. Street Cop did get a little extra ink though, not because it's good, just because Nintendo had a vested interest in pushing Power Pad games, since they picked up the peripheral for distribution from Bandai. So much for ethical journalism, jeez. Next time on NES Works, shootouts for the ages.